So as we start here a couple days before Rosh Hashanah, as we get closer to Yom Hadin, the intensity rises. So to our learning should be with a little bit more hasmada and kavana, and the hope is that the Rebbeinu Shalom will give refuah where it's needed, will give nefama where it's needed, and strength to all of us to continue doing kindness, Torah v'chesed, especially in the difficult days that we're dealing with all around. It seems like wherever we look, there's pain, whether it's illness, flooding, earthquakes, fires. This is what we say on Rosh Hashanah, right? Mi b'mayim, mi b'eij. So when we say that tefillah, we should really internalize that it's not just lip service, that this is real, it plays out, and we should continue to daven for ourselves, our families, our fellow man, and in that way, the Baruch Shalom will give us all a good year, a sweet year, a year of Shalom v'Shalom. So we started last week on Chof Gimel Amid Beis. Just to recount, we started with Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer. Reb Shimon ben Elazar was the Tana who said the last piece of our Mishnah that if you find a clay in Puria, whatever that means, you don't have to return it. So the Gemara started discussing what's a clay in Puria, and we got to the point where we said a clay in Puria was like a new vessel, which you just bought, right? So it's a vessel that you haven't yet used, so you're not comfortable with it. You might not pick it out if it got lost. So the theory was that if it got lost, then you give up, because no one will be able to make you know what that vessel is. So if you lose it, you basically give up. Okay, that's the simple explanation of Clay and Puria. But the Gemara gave one exception and said that there's something called Tzurva B'Rabbanan, which is that a Talmid Chacham has an appreciation or an eye for something that belongs to him, so that we equate that with the knowledge that if he lost an item, we should announce it. Why? Because a Tzurva Midrabanan would be able to recognize it even though it's brand new. So therefore the discussion is, if you have a brand new item, do you really have to announce it? Not for the Hamonam, for the general public. They won't know it. But because the Tzurva Rabbanan might know it, then you have to announce it. So that's the discussion. And then the Gemara just went off on a little bit of a tangent to tell us, how do you know it's Tzurva Rabbanan? And basically the Gemara said that someone who would tell the truth always, except maybe for three things, which we discussed briefly. Those three things, they might shade the truth because it's not something that you're supposed to speak openly. Learning, marital relations, giving shevach, giving praise to someone, a host who has given you a wonderful meal. You have to be careful not to overstate it. So these are all ways that we live a life that is yasher. And the understanding is that okay, you may shade that a little bit, but nothing else. And the Gemara gave one example from Mar Zutra, the famous example where someone took a silver cup and was missing, and Mar Zutra got very upset. So he surveyed the Bachrim, and he saw one Bacher who came to wash his hands, and when he couldn't find a towel, he turned to a jacket of a friend of his sitting there, and he wiped it in that. He says, that's got to be the Ganef, because a person who has no personal regard for someone else's possessions would certainly, even though he's a yeshiva person, a Torah person, would have no regard of maybe taking something that doesn't belong to him, and it turned out that he was the Ganef. So it was apparent to him, and that's the lesson learned, is that when you live a life of Torah, you live a straight life, and you don't cut corners, you don't go left, you don't go right. So that's how the Gemara interpreted. But basically, the underlying point from Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar was that Kli and Puria, but going back to that, you do not have to return. All right, so that's what we're up to. And it's about maybe 8 or so lines from the top of Chof Daled Amud Aleph. The Gemara starts with Tanya. We learned in the Brisa. Okay, so that's where we're holding it. So from here, we're going to go on. The Gemara says as follows. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Moder Rab Shimon ben Elazar, the Kalim Chadoshim. Rab Shimon ben Elazar is Moide. The Kalim Chadoshim Shivasayin Ayin Shechayv Lahachis. And that's what we just really repeated and said, that in the case where the eye does recognize, okay, we limited the Tzur Rabbanan, but the point was that even if it's a brand new Kli, but your eye can recognize it. You're a quick study and you bought something in the store, even though it looks like it's off the shelf like everything else, but you immediately recognize what's yours. Chayiv lahachriz. Okay, so you have to return it. Now, the Gemara goes on. What is that? What kind of Kli is that? So the Gemara doesn't tell us what kind of Kli it is. The Gemara wants to tell us what kind of Kli it isn't. Very odd. It's not going to tell us what kind of Kli is it that you can take off the shelf and look at it and know it's yours. No, the Gemara wants to tell us the Eluhen Kelim Chadashim Sholo Shibas Ha'ayin She'ein Chayiv Lahachris. No, I'm going to tell you those things that you don't have to return because you can't recognize them. Kind of an odd twist. The Gemara wants to tell us that something that you off the shelf you recognize you have to return, but we're not going to tell you what that is. We're going to tell you what it isn't. What isn't? What is it not? Kagon, says the Gemara, Bade Machten Bitzinoros. Bade Machten Bitzinoros. We'll see what that is in a minute. The Machroza Shel Krodmos. Okay. So what are we talking about? So let's take a look at Rashi. The Rashi that says, Kade Machtin the Tzinoris, the fourth line down from Rashi, the Kame Meferish, later on, we're going to talk about it in a minute. It's going to explain Bade Machtin, Shetolimbo Machtin. This is something that you hang hooks on or hang needles on. In other words, if you think of a sewing machine, I mean, I'm getting an example. A modern day sewing machine, if you ever see it, you see that there are needles or that you use on the sewing machine. So if you have needles hanging on top of the machine, they have to hang on something. So that's a bad. Okay, basically we say that it's like a rod. But bade machtin shetolim asmen b'tzinoras mazlogos ketanim shetavas bozov. Those are little mazlig is a fork, little forks that you spin gold. In other words, you have gold thread, and you want to make gold thread on a mentala, the Torah, whatever. You use these little forks. So what the Gemara is saying that these things are so mundane, meaning not unique, that if that's what you find, you don't have to return them because you can't distinguish one from the other. So if a person buys that in the store, that's an example of what you don't have to return. Yeah, Menashe.
Yeah, a clarification here, and I thought, and I just looked up to make sure I wasn't remembering wrong. Lahachris isn't that we don't, whether you do or don't have to return, it's whether we do or don't have to announce it.
Exactly.
Which is a big difference, because let's say, for example, you see one of these things and then you realize somebody was just walking by and they're dropping stuff from their bag all over the place. You could probably figure it's probably theirs, even though there's no identity. And there could be all kinds of situations where you don't see it literally fall, and yet you can figure out who it is, even though it has no identifying mark. It's the question of whether it's got an identifying mark such that we announce it.
So Menashe, you're exactly on point. I deliberately said that because that's the Gemara's kasha later on. So you're mechavan to the Gemara's kasha. So I said you don't have to return it, but you're right. It has nothing to do with returning. It has to do with announcing. But that's why I said it that way, to set it up. So when the Gemara is going to ask the kasha, we can say, oh, that's what the Gemara means. So, okay, so you're absolutely right. So let's hold the thought, and when we get to it, we'll repeat it, right? Because you're right. It has nothing to do with keeping it. It has to do with announcing, all right? So let's hold that thought, because that is a Gemara's kasha. But So the Gemara is giving examples of the kind of things that you don't have to announce. Correct. You don't have to announce. The machzorish of kromos, those are all also certain kinds of items that you don't have to announce. Okay. Now, says the Gemara weiter, Kol elu she'omru, this is what we said about what you don't have to announce. Emisai miturim, when can you keep it? Bisman shemotzan echad echad. If you find one hook or one fork, in other words, not a multitude, but you find one sitting there, then you say to yourself, what is this? I mean, who knows what this fork is, what this little needle is? I mean, or this little mod, what are we going to do? So again, the Gemara is giving you an example. Here, you don't have to, I'll say, return it, okay? But you don't have to announce it because you can't pick it out from one. But if you find two at a time, you have to return. Quickly look at Rashi. Achas va'achas, bad achas umazrik echod, one bad, one needle. Chayiv lahachris, the minyan have a siman. But if it's two, you have to return it. Why? Because we got through in the last week's Gemara saying that numbers are a siman. If someone came and said, I dropped 2 or 3 or something where you can identify it because it's a multitude, 1 is a simple number. Everybody can drop 1. So if you find something that is in the 1, you say, wait a minute, how would you possibly know your 1 needle from somebody else? But if you say, I dropped 2, that's already a siman, because who's going to drop 2? In other words, yeah, anybody can drop 2 or 3 or 4. But if you come and say there were 2 needles there, then the Gemara told us last week that minyan numbers are a siman. So you could say, yeah, I dropped 2, and that's the siman. And you would say, you're right, it was 2. So 1 you can't say is a siman, but 2 is you can say is a siman. So that's what the Gemara is saying here, is that even though it's something that looks like every other needle off the shelf, but if it's more than 1, then you're already getting into something a little bit different, and that can be a siman. Okay, so we still haven't defined what is a bad. So the Gemara wants to just finish and say, my bade, Zok the Gemara, shuchi, Rashi, anofim shel ilon. Shuach is like the branch of a tree. In other words, but my correlate bade, why do you call it bad? The definition of a bad is a rod. Why do you call it bad? Dover the tolebe midi, bad correlate. Anything that you hang on it is a bad. So in other words, if you have hanging pelts or hanging furs or hanging anything, that's called a bad. It's just like a branch of a tree. On a tree, you can hang anything. So that's just a definition. So the Gemara wants to tell us that if you have something hanging off a rod, then if it looks like everything else, then of course it's not a siman. But if something is unique, such as, oh, it's 2 or 3, meaning that it's not just 1, which any 1 is the basic number, then you can accept that as a siman. The Gemara wants to sort of bring a raya, kahud etnan, because we learned, right? We learned in the Brayso, and actually he says it's a Masechta Sukkah, right? By Aravis. Ola echad, bavad echad. There's a machlokes in the Gemara there. Look at Rashi. Ola echad, bavad echad, the Masechta Sukkah, gabi arava. Okay, now we're going to come to Sukkot, and you're going to learn Hilchas Sukkot, and there's always halachas that come out from shul, telling us what's a kosher arava. How do you know when you have a arava that isn't kosher anymore? And so there's a machlokes in the Gemara there. Take a look. Shenishu miktas alel. Let's say by the 4th, 5th day of Sukkot, it's starting to look like a pretty klapped arava. We're not talking about a shanas here, where you clap. But even an arava in your lulav can look pretty sad by the 4th or 5th day because it starts drying up. So what is halachically acceptable? Says the Gemara there, Shlosha alen lachin. Ve'ikid amre afila ol achad bevan achad kisher. There's a machlokes there whether if you have one little arava sitting there on the branch, it's kosher. So the machlokes there, Rav Sheshes and Rav Nachman, as to whether one is okay or three is okay. Now, by Hadassim, we have to have three. That's a different story. But by a Rava, what's considered kosher? So anyway, we're not talking the halachas and machlokes there, whether it's one or whether it's three. So he wants to say, according to Rav Sheshes, that it's one, that Ola Echad Bavad Echad is considered acceptable. Again, what's the point? The point is that we're making this distinction that Bavad Echad, that if you have a rod or a tree or a branch, and it has one of something, then that one is okay, that's universal. One is okay. So if it had one, you wouldn't be able to say, oh, it's my Arava. It looks like every other Arava on the fifth day of Sukkot. It's got one leaf hanging out there, or three, according to Rav Nachman. So again, it's a little bit of a tenuous comparison, but basically what the Gemara is telling us is that in order to have a siman, it has to be something different than the ordinary. So if it's different than the ordinary because it's more than one, or because it looks a little bit different than what you might find off the shelf, then that's considered a siman. Otherwise, it's not a siman. Okay, that's just generally speaking how we have to understand what a siman is. I would say, generally speaking, that if you find something, okay, even la halacha, if you find something and you announce it, okay, so the question is you have to announce it, and someone responds, you don't take a stringent view of someone's response if he's trying to articulate what it is and somehow it looks like a dozen other things. So if he says, yes, it's mine, but this, that, the other, so you as the finder shouldn't necessarily take a very hard approach and says, no, I can't give it to you because you didn't describe what it is. We say, even La Halakha and the Moshe and others say, you know, if you find it and someone is having a difficult time articulating what he lost, but he gets even in the ballpark, then it's Hashavas Aveda. Okay, so you give it to him. But when we're talking strictly speaking, do you even have to announce it if you find something that, remember, to announce it means you got to do something. You got to go to the base medrash, you got to clap on the shulchan, you got to post a note. You have to do more than just say, hi, I found it. So the question is, what achrayus do we put on you to make an announcement that someone else should possibly find it? That's what this Gemara is all about. So the Gemara is giving you the lowest common denominator, that if it looks like anything else because it's one, or because it's a needle, or because it's something that is 1,000 other things look like it, okay, we pater you from having to make an announcement. You don't have to go out of your way. You can, but you don't. But once it starts looking a little bit different than everything else that you might find, then you already have an achrayus of a Hashavas Aveda that you have to announce it and that someone then can describe what it is. That's what this Gemara is really telling us. Okay, so that's the beginning of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Now the rest of this Gemara is going to go back to understanding more clearly what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is all about, because he's the one who told us about Klei and Puria, and we're saying Klei and Puria is something that might look like 100 other things, and therefore you won't recognize it. So here the Gemara is going to start extrapolating what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is talking about, and in what case you can, and what case you can't. So we have an interesting Gemara that's going to discuss that. All right, so now we start. Aside from this Mishnah, where he talks about Klei and Puria, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar said in other places, "Amatzil min ha'ari." Let's say you go to the zoo, and in the lion's cage, you see something sitting over there that looks out of place. Okay, and you want to try to grab it. And there was a story recently about someone who jumped into a lion's cage and wanted to pull something out. I forget exactly the details of it. But there are people like that. So if you saved something from a lion's cage, or min doe from a bear, or min nemer from an eagle, you're not in the cage. I mean, you see the eagle hovering over something and you quickly grab it. Min bardalos, and Rashi tells us a bardalos that's some kind of a leopard or a cat or something. Min zuto shel yam, or from the tides of the ocean. We had this Gemara, we had this already before. Mishloso shel nahar, over the overflowing of the banks of the water. Remember, we said that those in those cases there's years. Okay, hamotzi besarte uplate gedola, or someone finds it, and Rashi will tell us it's like a highway or a huge, huge square, like Red Square in Moscow, Times Square in New York. Ubekol makom sheharabim mitzuyim sham, hare elu shelo mipnei shehabalim misyashim. Okay, this is articulated by Rav Shimon ben Eliezer. He wants to give us an example of what are the things that you do not have to return. So, if in other words, if a person lost something and he saw an eagle swoop it, or a bear, or all those other things, or the river, or the ocean, or Times Square, all those kinds of things you do not have to return because inherently a person is miyayish. If you're walking along Times Square, okay, and then you come to your hotel and you tap your pocket and say, "Oh my gosh, where's my watch?" And you just walk through Times Square, you're not going back through Times Square to search the streets to find your watch because you say in Times Square, it's over. Or I was just in a den of bears, or an example, or whatever it might be, or I was walking along the highway and cars driving back and forth. Basically, a person is miyayish. It's interesting, he makes a chilik between a Rishus Harabim and a super Rishus Harabim, which I find interesting because we're not talking about, if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi says, Badlas Savua, it's a the derech la'arog uzim mitaglim. It's a kind of a cat that kills chickens and geese. The whole mokum sheharabim v'afilu dovish yeshbo simin, even though you had a watch that had your name engraved. Okay, so we'll see what these are. So all of these are examples of Rishus Harabim. So in other words, there a person's vade miyayish because there is no chance that he is going to find it. So okay, that's this pronounced statement of Rav Shimon ben Eliezer that you do not have to return in those kinds of, and you can extrapolate other examples, but this gives you an idea of what is considered so extreme that a person is miyayish without regard, because there's no way he's going to find it. Okay, right? The Gemara is going to go into the details. So what's the kasha? Right? The Gemara asks the kasha in boilahu. Kikomer Rav Shimon ben Eliezer. So there's a series of questions here. What does Rav Shimon ben Eliezer really mean? When Rav Shimon ben Eliezer says you don't have to return it, is it Barov Kananim? Is it because you're in a place that's mostly non-Jews? Abu Barov Yisrael lo. But if this same thing happened in Yerushalayim Yar Kodesh, you would have to return it because you're talking about a town of Jews, of Yidden, who are machshiv, they revere Shabbos Aveda, and without question, if they jump on it, they'll jump on it and make an announcement. So in other words, let's parse Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer's words and understand what is he really talking about. Because remember, this can impact the halacha. Is it because we're in a non-Jewish place and therefore, in other words, Canaanim, even though they're nice people, we're not talking about that. We're saying they have no impulse to Shabbos Aveda. So if someone finds something on Times Square, he'll pick it up and put it in his pocket. A Yid might think, oh, maybe another Yid dropped it. Maybe yes, maybe no. But derech klal, a Kanani won't. That's one kasha. Or Dilma afilu barov Yisrael nami. Even in Yerushalayim Yar Kodesh, Omayim Timtza Nami. Why? Because he'll say, how could you possibly return something that's found in a public square? There's Yush. In other words, that's the kasha. So what is Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer talking about? Weiter. Im Timtza Loma Afilu Barov Yisrael Nami. Omar, if you're going to say that even in a Rov Yisrael, in Yerushalayim Yar Kodesh, you don't have to return, Pligi Rabban Aleo or lo Pligi, are the Chachamim, the Tanakama of the Mishnah, Are they going to argue on him? Because normally when you have when you have someone say something and he's the Tana Basra, the Tana Kama say the opposite. So will the Tana Kama, the Rabbanan, argue on him or not? We don't know. The imtim tzalom pligi, and if you're going to say the Tana Kama will argue on Rav Shimon Gamliel, Rov Yisrael vade pligi, Rov Kananim pligi or lo pligi. So you're going to say, okay, when could they possibly argue? Rov Yisrael in Yerushalayim, but Rov Kanani, if you're in a non-Jewish surrounding or in a city where there are mostly Kananim, pligi or lo pligi. Again, the Gemara is plumbing the depths here because we make a very general statement. How deep do you go into that statement? We don't know. The imtim saloma pligi, and if you're going to say the Tana Kama is arguing, what are they arguing on? Afilibrov Kananim, halacha kamoso, or ain't halacha kamoso? Who is the halacha like? In other words, again, we don't know. The imtim saloma halacha kamoso, and if you said the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, dafke barov Kananim, or afilibrov Yisrael. So this is a series of questions that the Gemara is showing us. It's not so simple. Just because Rav Shimon Gamliel says this and Rabbanan say that, you could break it down into so many nafkaminas. And by the way, we see this in the Gemara, is that the whole point of the intellectual exercise in Gemara is to keep splitting hairs and understanding. It's not really splitting hairs. When someone makes a statement, how general is that statement, or how specific is that statement? So Rav Shimon Gamliel says you don't have to return it. Is that always the case? Or maybe only Barov Kananim? Or maybe even Barov Yisrael? So these are all the questions that the Gemara asks on that brisa. And now the Gemara is going to take step by step to try to make us understand whether or not Rav Shimon Gamliel's words are sui generis to cover every possible situation where he says ein chayv lahachriz or no. So that's what the Gemara is going to try to tell us.
Would have been so much easier if Rabbi Gamliel would have just told us, but that would be too easy. Okay.
Exactly. But you see, we're not making it easy, Chaim. Gamliel says he was sitting in the base medrash and he pronounced. And maybe the Bachram in the Shiur would say, Rebbe, are we talking about Kanani? But the Gemara didn't bring it down. The Gemara didn't bring down the discussion in the Shiur if they asked those questions. So now we're sitting here, okay, we're learning the Gemara, and the Amoraim are asking the Kasha, Taka, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, you're a Gavaldige Talmud Chacham, but what did you mean? Tell us what you meant.
But the reason they didn't tell us is because Ratzu, Rabbi Gamliel, the Talmid of Lezakum says Yisrael.
Well, again, when you see this oftentimes with a gadol, he'll give you the Rosh Prakim. He'll tell you something, but he'll leave a lot of it to discussion. So the discussion, he won't give you in the Shiur.
But for the sake of the discussion, I mean, they want you to,
You're exactly right. So the Gemara, that's why the Gemara here is now plumbing the depths and say, what did Rav Shimon Gamliel mean when he said, Ein chayv lahachris? So now that's exactly right. We're the Talmidim, and we're going to go into the details of what he meant. Was there another question?
Rabbi, the sages observed probably a very stark contrast between the behavior of Jews and non-Jews at that point. But in our time, lost and found has become a standard institution, not particularly Jewish. It's so that probably would have an impact on the halacha today.
Absolutely right. So in other words, now you look at the times and you say, today, there's such a thing as a lost and found department. So if you lose something in Times Square, maybe you will, maybe you won't. But if there's a lost and found department in Times Square, you might not be miyayish so quickly. You'll say, you know what? Let me take a stab at it. I'll go to the lost and found department. Maybe some good Samaritan found my watch and brought it into the lost and found department. I mean, you hear these crazy stories about someone losing a wallet full of everything, and then all of a sudden, someone calls him up and say, I found your wallet, and he's in Seattle, Washington, and you're in Washington, D.C. Yeah, you must have left it on the plane, and all of a sudden I saw a wallet, and I saw a name, and I called up. I mean, how crazy is that? But it happens. So you're right. It's all Lefi Azman, but in those days when there was no Pony Express, I mean, there was no nothing. So if a person lost it, That's it. He lost it. There's no cell phone for him to call up, or if I found your name, I'll say Shimon ben Baruch. Who's Shimon ben Baruch? Forget about it. I mean, you left it on the horse and buggy, and the horse and buggy now went 150 miles, and then someone is about to enter into that horse and buggy, and he finds something sitting there. And he says, "Who is this? This could have been from another door." So you're right. Kol lefi hasman, but in the time of the Gemara is trying to give us, which is why the Gemara for its time was telling us halacha. Today we have a Shulchan Aruch, but we have all kinds of other svarim that clarify the halacha al pi hazman. So then you have Tuvas from Rabbi Moshe and from all the other Gedolim, which further clarify the halacha, because we're living in a time when different things happen. And because of that, it's not one size fits all to say, oh, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said you don't have to do it. I'm potter from Hashavas Aveda. No, you're not. Good point, though. I mean, it's okay. So now these are all the shilas, and now we're going to try to peel away the onion skin and understand what it is that the Gemara is really telling us. Tosh Shema. Come and listen. Okay, and there's several of these, so we'll start with one. This is a brisa which says if someone went into a Beis HaKnesses or a Beis HaMedrash and he found money, now money is a pretty generic item. So look at Rashi. Hamotzi mos, says Rashi, kosol kedata tzibure mos, not scattered money, but piles of money. In other words, you come into the Beis Medrash, your eyes wander, and all of a sudden you see a stack of 15 quarters. A person doesn't drop 15 quarters into a stack. Doesn't happen. You might find them lying around, which we do when we pick them up. But if it's a stack of 15 quarters, Diktani, says Rashi, misnissen chayev lahachriz, right? So you have to return that. In our case, you don't. Let's go back in the brisa. So this brisa is telling us that if you go into Beis Medrash or Beis HaKnesses and you see 15 quarters stacked one on top of the other, you don't have to return it. That's not a siman. I mean, it is a siman, but bailam misyashi. In other words, the principle of yiyush is so great that if you go into a public place and find something that is a little bit odd because it's quarters stacked on top of each other, you don't have to return it.
And so in here, they're not making a distinction between a Jewish locale and Times Square. They're talking about a Beis HaMedrash of all places. And they're talking about something that you yourself, Rabbi Grauman, say is a shtickle siman, the fact that it's stacked up. And yet we're still imputing yiyush.
Correct. But I'll correct one thing you said, Chaim, because you anticipated the Gemara, and I'm going to say, let's interpret this brisa strictly. You go into a Jewish shul or a Jewish Beis Medrash, and you find a stack of quarters piled high, says the brisa, you don't have to return them. Why? Because there's yiyush. That's all this brisa says. Okay. Now, it's up to us to understand, what is this brisa telling us? So l'chayra, the brisa is telling us what Rav Shimon Gamliel just said.
Right.
That if you go into a public place, what's a public place? A place where a lot of people go. It doesn't matter if it's Jewish or non-Jewish, right? I mean, again, surface. It doesn't matter what it is. A person who put his 15 quarters down on the floor is not going to find them, and he's miyayish.
So the brisa is seemingly staking out that maximalist position.
Correct.
Jewish under all cases.
Correct. That's what we're starting from.
Okay.
We're saying there's 100% yiyush because it's a public place. No distinction between Jewish, non-Jewish, anything. It's a public place, and therefore there's yiyush. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's interesting, the particular example, because we're talking about in a shul or Beis Medrash. If I found not having read this Gemara, if I found a stack of literally 15 quarters piled up on one of the pews, I would think, oh, I wouldn't think to take it for myself. I mean, I might think that, but I would hopefully think what I usually see if I see a little bit of change lying around the shul, which is somebody brought it. Maybe they dropped out of their pocket, but maybe, and particularly if it's stacked up, they brought it because they know that they can give tzedakah easily. They were cleaning their house for Pesach. They found all this loose change around. They said, you know what? I'm going to bring it to shul and put it in the pushka. And then they left and they forgot to put in the pushka. However, if on the other hand, if I see a stack of $10, $20 bills in shul, that I wouldn't think, oh, maybe they would just do that. And that's where I would start to be thinking of, oh, can I keep it or should I be machers?
Right. So your theory is very much a rational theory, but at this point in time, from this brisa, we're going to reject the theory that you have to announce it because it's a reshus harabim. A lot of people come into shul. There's 3 minyanim, one after the other, and it's like the shtiblach that you have in Borough Park or in Yerushalayim Kodesh, where it's like a minion factory. People just keep coming, and how are you going to possibly identify? Having said that, I'm going to tell you just an interesting side note. I was in New York the other day, and I'm davening in a minyan, and I noticed something which I hadn't seen other than in Yerushalayim. What is that? We're not familiar with this here in Kemp Mill, but later, unfortunately, in big cities with a lot of people, there's a lot of aniyim, a lot of poor people, and they keep running in and out of minyanim to collect tzedakah in the middle of davening. Imagine that, in the middle of davening, they're running in to collect stuff, but we don't necessarily know from this. So what did someone do? The Baal Tefillah, the chazan in the shul that I saw, when he started davening, he went into his wallet and took out a stack of $1 bills, and he put them on the almond that he was davening. Why? Because when these aniyim came into the shul and made the circuit in the middle of davening, they saw his stack, and it's already an unwritten rule that an ani goes over and takes $1 and moves on. I've seen it in Yerushalayim where people stack shekalim on the table. I've seen it, and someone comes in, the davener doesn't even pay attention, but the ani literally takes a shekel and moves on. So these stacks of dollars are meant for the aniyim. Now let's say that he finished davening, and there weren't enough aniyim to take all his money, and he walks away and leaves the stack on the stender. He forgets about it. It was already dedicated, let's say, to tzedakah. He doesn't take it. He forgot it, whatever. Now the next guy comes along. I mean, you as a balabos, you come along, and you're starting to daven at that stender. You see a stack of dollars. Are you going to know that that stack of dollars was someone else's dollars that he was giving to the aniyim? You might, or you might not. Says Rav Shimon Gamliel, that if you find a stack of dollars in a base medrash where people are coming and going, and you have no havamina, who possibly, you don't know who was the Baal Tefillah before you, you can take it. You don't have to announce it, because it is Reshus Harabim. It's in a place where people come and go, and Mistama, he was miyayesh. The first guy left the money and was miyayesh, even if it was for tzedakah. Now you could be a good guy and say, you know what, I'm going to leave it there so that the next group of aniyim can come and get it. But if you don't, you haven't done anything wrong. According to this brisa, that's what we're trying to say. That the manda of this brisa will say that it is, now, I'm saying we're giving a bliyah, but I take it back for a minute. It's a brisa that is not named. Now, let's go weiter. My shemata, the ozel basa ruva. So what do we learn from here? That you go after the rove, meaning who are the majority of the people that are in this place, this shul, this bate kiniyas or bate mizrashis. So we say Rabbi Shimon Gamliel shemata minei. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is the one who is the author of this brisa. And what does he say? Afilu b'rov Yisrael nami. That even though you're in a base medrash or in a shul, and you come in and you see this stack, and the brisa says, "Hare elu shalom." So what are we taking from this brisa? This is clearly a proof to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who says that whether it's a non-Jewish or a Jewish place, if it's a makom rabim where a lot of people come, you don't have to announce it. So l'chayra, at this stage, this brisa is a raya to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, because it's exactly what Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says. I come into a shul, come into a beis medrash, I see money stacked. Clearly, the person whose money it is miyayish, right? It seems like it's on all fours. It stacks up exactly like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. So l'chayra, we have a raya. The Gemara asks the kasha, is it a raya? Yeah, it's a raya from this brisa, because clearly that's what the case is. And for the Gemara, no, you can't bring a raya from here. Hocha b'maya skinan, see that abbreviation? Hocha b'maya skinan. You know what? This brisa is b'mufuzarin. Brisa is not speaking about a stack of quarters, 15 quarters high. If it was 15 quarters high, it's a siman. Forget about it. We're talking about 15 quarters just lying around. Now, if you find 15 quarters lying around, mufuzarin, scattered around, then you can take it, and you don't have to announce it. So not so fast. It's not a raya to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, because according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, you can take it. No, you know when you can take it? When it's mufuzarin. But if it's stacked, then clearly that's a siman. Remember, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel is coming to tell us that in a public place, someone is miyayish. So now we're splitting it up and saying, you know, when someone's miyayish, when the money is scattered around, he has no hava minute he's going to find it. It could be it came out of your pocket, my pocket. We all carry loose change. So loose change is loose change. It has, what's the siman? Abraham Lincoln on the penny? That's not a siman. So therefore, in that case, you can take it. But if I find 15 quarters stacked up high, no one's miyayish 15 quarters stacked up high, because I know I put it there on purpose. And I'm relying on the garbage stucker, like Menashe said, wait a minute, 15 quarters, I don't like the looks of that. I'm going to maybe go to the bima, and I'm going to pound on the shulchan, and I'm going to say, I found someone left money in the shul. Can someone come and tell me what it was? And I'm going to come and say, yeah, sure. It was my 15 quarters stacked one on top of the other. And that's a good siman. And that would not be a raya from Shimon ben Gamliel. So the Gemara here is trying to slug up the raya and saying you can't bring a raya that's from Shimon ben Gamliel. That if you come into a shul and you find money, that it is yours because it's a public place and someone's miyayish. Yeah, someone's miyayish by mufuzarin, by scattered money, but not by deliberate money, deliberate dollars or quarters or whatever it is standing. So that's the Gemara's kasha.
But I may have missed something, but I've got Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar all over this sugya.
What did I say? Shimon ben Gamliel, right?
Says it's Shimon ben Elazar, right?
Shimon ben Elazar. I'm sorry, Shimon ben Elazar. Yeah.
I thought I missed something. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Shimon ben Elazar. I'm sorry. Right. So l'chayra, we wanted to try to bring a raya that he was the man, the omer of this brisa. You can't bring a raya because it's not all fours the way he would say it. Correct the Gemara, even mufuzarin, if we're talking about most mufuzarin scattered, my area, makom sharab mitzuin sham, why do you have to specifically say that we're talking about where the rabbin is found? I feel ain't a rab mitzuin sham. So now so you wanted to slug it up by saying we're talking about mufuzarim. I have a better kasha. If it's mufuzarim, why do you specifically have to tell us? If you find it in a really public place, then you don't have to announce it. Are you kidding? Even a not so public place, you don't have to announce it. It's mufuzarim. There is no siman in mufuzarim. So it's a kasha on the shluga. You want to slug up and say it's not Rav Shimon ben Elazar because we're talking about Mefuzarim. Since no riot to our brisa, that's not proof positive because Mefuzarim is good anywhere, not just in a public place. So it's a kasha on the kasha. Good kasha, right? And for the Gemara, no. La'olam b'tzrurin. We're really talking about stacked money. So now we're back to square one. We're talking about piles of money. V'hocha b'maya skinan. What are we talking about here? And this is, I think it was your point, Chaim, or whoever asked the question in the beginning. You know what we're talking about? Bebote kinesia shel kenanim. We're not talking about a shul. We're talking, kinesios means a gathering place. We talk about a beis haknesses as a shul, right? That's the term we use for a shul, a beis haknesses. Strictly speaking, kinesia is gathering. So, bote kinesia shel kenanim, you can have a non-Jewish bote knesses, a gathering place, a town hall, right? The Rotary Club has a meeting place. That's a beis haknesses in the strict speaking of the word. So take a look at Rashi. So Rashi Berov Yisrael the stam botik Kinesias Yisrael bohin. Okay, in other words, before we have the Havamina, what's a beis haknesses? A shul, right? Mufuzarim Rabbanan he the mode, but Mufuzarim that nan most Mufuzarim have elu shalom. Kinesias asifas mokem shemichnasim sham lehisyayitz v'lehisvaye. It's a debate hall, right? A debate hall where people come together to debate, to have a party, or whatever it has. So the term bote kinesias is not what we know. So therefore, the Gemara wants to give an answer. My skin, bote kinesias shel kenanim. So what's the answer? The answer is that you don't know we're talking about a Jewish place. Maybe we're talking about a Kanani place. So in other words, to slug up Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar as to what he means, we're saying not so fast that we have a raya that there's Yush in a Beis HaKnesses. We could be talking about a non-Jewish place for which a Jewish person who loses even stacked money will give up right away, because we don't hold that a non-Jew will be Hashavas Haveda even for something like 15 stacked quarters. In other words, 15 stacked quarters in a shul, oh, of course someone will give it back. But 15 stacked quarters in a town hall, forget about it. Yeah.
So two things. One, I noticed, and I have to maybe look a little further elsewhere. It's interesting that the Gemara using different terms at different times for gathering of or presence of non-Jews, because Canaanim, if we think about it, by the time of the Gemara, there was no nation of Canaan. We had all kinds of non-Jews, but even in Eretz Yisrael, the Canaanim were gone. It was other non-Jews. And so
it's a euphemistic term for a non.
But then to use different euphemisms at different times.
Yes.
All right. But aside from that, I wonder if there's, and maybe they'll talk about this, an interesting though distinction, which is normal or often, and we've had this previously. You'll refer to, let's say, the marketplace or something where you have a lot of people coming and going as an example of a lot of people, and therefore confusion who lost stuff or whatever. It sounds like maybe there's an issue here about Knesios, whether it's Jewish or non-Jewish, the idea that it's not literally just, it's not like Times Square where you just have everybody coming and going and passing through, but rather a place people come for a certain amount of time and then they leave and maybe another group of people comes. You have a lot of people over the course of a day, but it's not that they're literally just passing through. They come in for 5 minutes to buy their produce. They're there for a purpose.
Right.
So I think that's another example they're adapting to what they confronted as the world changed, because the Tanoim were contemporaries of the Roman occupation. One of the standard things in a Roman town was a Roman forum, which fit exactly the description that Rabbi Grauman gave before, people coming in to debate and talk and you chew over things and they leave. And as Minash just said, then other people come in to chew the fat too. Exactly. You're adapting to what was going on in their world.
That's a perfect example. I was going to give another example. If you've ever been to England, and you go to Hyde Park, there's something called Speaker's Corner. And Speaker's Corner is mamish, there's large crowds and people stand around and someone gets up and talks. And he talks about and at Narishkeit, it doesn't matter what he talks. It gives everybody a stender to get up and speak. Now he finishes and he talks about taxes, and someone else talks about human rights. And then people leave and another group of people come and they start listening to what he says. Now it could be indoors, that's outdoors. But so a Bate Kinesias is exactly that, a Roman Forum, the Speaker's Corner. It's a place where people can pontificate and people listen and then people move on. Such places, says the Gemara, there's no havamina that someone is not going to be miyayish, because you got hundreds of people coming and going within a matter of an hour. If I dropped money, there's no question. Now, the question here is, I didn't drop money. I piled money down on the floor. I put it in a corner there and I dropped it down. So we're saying that if it's a Kanani, euphemistically a non-Jewish place, what's my havamina that someone is going to return to me? I'm miyayish. Even if I know I put it there, it wasn't an accident. I didn't drop 15 quarters by accident and they piled. You can be sure. I put them there, but I put them there. Why? Because I don't know. I went out and I didn't want someone to rob me. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. Do I have a havamina? I'm going to come back and find those 15. It's there for anybody to take. So if it's a mokum kanani, I give up. If it's a mokum base Knesset, a shul, base medrash, no. So this is what the Gemara is going through, and it is doing exactly what we wanted to do. We're having this discussion to break it down and understand a brisa that has, in general terms, Bate Kinesias, Bate Midrashes, Hare Elu Shalo, it's miyayish. What happened here? So we started out by saying, oh, it was a shul. Wait a minute, it's not a shul, it's a speaker's corner. If it's a speaker's corner, okay, but it's money piled. No, it's not money piled. It's money scattered. If it's money scattered, why does it have to be a speaker's corner? It could be the corner of our Kola and Kurzi, which has no Rabin. It's just Rabin. Teretz is, it's really a pile. Now, if it's a pile, that's already unusual, but we're talking here about now, let's just finish the point. If you're talking about Kananim, but the Midrashis Mai, what do you say about a base medrash? There's no Kanani base medrash. We said Bate Kinesias and Bate Midrashis. Why does it say two? Because there's a distinction. We know in our parlance that a base of Knesset is to daven and a base medrash is to learn. That's how we are brought up. You go to a base medrash to learn, even though we daven in a base medrash, but we go to base medrash to learn, and the base of Knesset is to daven. Correct the Gemara. If we're talking about a Bate Kinesias non-Jewish, what about a bet medrash? There's no non-Jewish base medrash, and you say it in one breath. So how could you distinguish between a Bate Kinesias and a Bate Midrash if one is non-Jewish, one is Jewish? So my Yikalamemer. So the Gemara again. We're splitting hairs here, but we're splitting it because we want to come to an clear understanding of what this brisa is talking about. And for the Gemara, Bate Midrashis Didan, the Yasve Be Kananim. In our base medrash, and unfortunately, we're reliving this brisa today, because if you look at Rashi, what I mean here is Kinesias Asifas Makim Shmanatim Shalom Lisatzviv, Yasvibo Kananim, you have a base medrash, the Yasvibo Kananim, Shem Chutz Le'ir, the Bate Midrashis those days were outside of the city, Moshivim Bo Kananim Lishmor, and they brought in Kananim to guard the base medrash so that they shouldn't be attacked from people who are looking to do ill to the Jewish people. In other words, your base medrash was sitting outside the city. Everybody came to learn, but if it was not locked, you could have Gemavim who would come in and Chas v'shalom hold up the base medrash. So they had non-Jewish guards posted at the doors. Lahavdil, what are we living today? We go to a shul and we have to have non-Jewish guards guarding us so that we can daven. I mean, it's literally a couple of thousand years later, and we're back to the time of the Gemara. So therefore, what's the Gemara saying? We have Canaanim who are in the building, and those Canaanim could have lost the money. Now we're back to square one. If you have a base medrash full of Torah learning Jews, and you have a number of Canaanim who are doing a good deed by guarding all the doors, maybe they dropped the money, or maybe someone else dropped the money and the Canaanim will pick it up. So once again, we're back to the question of Yiyush. If it's only solely a Jewish institution with Jewish people, okay, a person will feel better that a Jew knows Hashavas Aveda and he'll return it. But if you're in a building with a lot of Canaanim, nice people, but they have no clue what Hashavas Aveda is, and they see quarters stacked on the floor, what's a Canaani going to do? Going to pick it up and put it in his pocket. Again, we're talking now in a general sense, right? There could be those who won't, but in a general sense, a Canaani is, you don't attribute to him the mitzvah of the Shabbos Aveda. So that's what the Gemara says here. Kasha is botem midrashis didam, the yas v'bo Canaanim. Hashda the osas lahachi, right? But the Keniziyas namididan, the yas v'bo Canaanim. So the Gemara just wants to tie the loop and tell us, since we're talking about Canaanim, we don't have to talk about a bote Keniziyas non-Jewish, meaning a debate hall. We could be talking about a Jewish shul, but the Yasve Imi Kanani, which is exactly what we have today at Shomrei and all the other shuls, is you have shuls that are guarded by Canaanim who could have lost the money. Anyway, this is an aside. So where are we now? At the end of this Tashma, we're nowhere further than we were, because we don't know whether Rav Shimon ben Elazar is the author of this brisa, because the Gemara went through all these permutations and combinations to say that Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is the author of the brisa, and we end up saying we don't know, because we split into all different components, and in each component there's a reason to say yes and a reason to say no. So again, if you think it's simple, it's not. It's not. You just can't hang your hat and say the brisa says that b'chol makom sharab mitzuyin sham har elu shenov b'shabalam misyaishin. What? When are the misayish? Is it stacked? Is it not stacked? Is it a Jewish shul? Is it a non-Jewish gathering place?
If we give ourselves the leeway to stuff the sausage into whatever casing we want, then we'll never come to any determination, because you can always just say, no, we were talking about this instance, so it doesn't prove anything. No, we were talking about that instance.
Right. But Chaim, you're 100% right. But let's understand something. The beauty is in the journey, not in the maskana.
Okay.
But the beauty is exactly what you just said. Is it or isn't it?
Okay.
We're going through in our mind all these machinations that when something is said, don't take it on face value.
Right.
Try to break it down. Now you could say it's just an exercise, but it is an exercise. It's trying to, that's what we shakla v'tarya. In other words, we're in the process of trying to understand when the Bryce has said something without it being as specific as it could be. So very often the Gemara gives us a satisfactory conclusion and gives us an answer because the answer has to be this. In this particular Bryce, okay, this is not the end of the story. There will be other Bryces. At the end of this Bryce, we don't have an understanding of what of who it's like. Maybe it's like Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Maybe it's like the Tanakama who argues on Rav Shimon ben Elazar, which you'll see from the Gemara Vaita later on, that is a conclusion sometimes the Gemara has to give. Is we're trying to prove Rav Shimon ben Elazar. Sorry, can't prove it. Too many permutations and combinations, too many kashas. So anyway, so this Gemara where we left now is it brought down a brisa. We broke the brisa down, and at the end of the day, we don't have a conclusion because we can't say clearly from this brisa. Now you could say that if it was a Jewish shul, and there were no Jew. Again, we're talking about a Jewish shul with non-Jewish guards, etc., etc. So again, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is l'tamei, that he says yes, you can do it, and Rabbanan l'tamei, let's say that you can't. But from this brisa, we can't bring a total hachlota. So we're gonna stop here because now we're gonna go to another brayso mitzvah next week. That again we're gonna try to break it down and bring a raya from there. But this whole discussion is just food for thought. Is that this is how the Gemara works? Is that you have to really apply and break down and you could say, oh, it's far-fetched. We're talking about the kinesias. It means a shul. It means this. It means that. But and again, as David said, today all these terms may have different meanings than from the time of the Gemara, because today and Lamaisa we see from today a different set of concerns. Even if we could answer the Gemara then, today it's not so simple because today, you go to a shul and you expect the shul to be all Yidden, and for all you know, a good part of the shul is not Yidden. I mean, there are other people. So anyway, this is where we'll stop. And wishing
Even the
everybody.
Knesset itself, a Knesset is just an assembly hall. It's where people assemble.
Right, and the best example is the Knesset in Eretz Yisrael.
That's what I'm saying.
Why is it called the Knesset? It's not a shul.
It's an assembly
Knesset.
hall. It's where, yeah.
And who resides in the Knesset? You have Arabs, you have Jews,
Right.
you have all stripes of people. That's a perfect, good example, Chaim, of a Knesset that is what the Gemara is talking about here, where you can't just jump to conclusion that it's a holy place, a place where people would only say, "Oh, Hashavas Haveda, it's the biggest mitzvah in the
No,
world."
Adarabba, it's politicians there. You wouldn't trust any money.
Exactly, you're exactly right. A politician Nevada you wouldn't trust. So anyway, that's very good examples of how this Gemara is helping us break down to understand. So Mitzvah Shem will pick up next week from that Tashma, and we'll try it again with another Tashma. So everybody should have a good year. And we wish everybody all good things, Mitzvah Shem.
Amen.
All right, so next week, Mitzvah Shem will continue.